Support for this episode of Trifles is brought to you by the Baker Street Journal, the leading publication of Sherlockian scholarship since 1946. Find them online at bakerstreetirregulars.com. And also by the generous support of listeners like you who choose to support us at Patreon for as little as $1 a month. Patreon.com/trifles. Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, the stone was Mazarin, the carbuncle was blue, and the mane was lion, but there are so many other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
You know the plots, but what about the minutiae? Have you ever stopped to wonder about what kind of chemistry experiments Sherlock Holmes was running? Or what a yeggman is? Or why Holmes's index was sorted haphazardly?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Burt Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 280, Sherlock Holmes and Shakespeare. Hello and welcome to Trifles, the Sherlock Holmes podcast where we look into the details in the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Burt Wolder.
And Burt, I mean, this is the perfect place for us to use the trope that we use in I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere and say the game's afoot.
Yes, the game is afoot, and it just reeks with literary allusion.
Is that what that stench is? Excellent.
Yes.
Oh, well, glad to know it's not just me. Well, we will share any show notes that are relevant on ihose.co/trifles280. That'll take you to the SherlockHolmesPodcast.com website to this specific episode. Feel free to look around in the archives there. We are now on our 6th season. You can listen to us on whatever podcast player you choose, but please feel free to look through our back catalog. This is our 280th episode, so there are plenty of topics from which to choose if your interest is in Sherlock Holmes and the stories. And I should also note that we do have a way for people to get involved. If you'd like to support the show on Patreon for as little as $1 a month, you can become a show supporter, and every single patron that we have is automatically entered into a drawing every month for random back issues of the Baker Street Journal, our sponsor here, and for a quarterly drawing for what is it? Oh, yeah, it is for an annual subscription to the Baker Street Journal. So feel free to support the show at whatever level appeals to you, and you will be entered to win those wonderful prizes. Good luck. All right. Well, we've got the Hound of the Baskervilles barking in the background, and that's perfect because it occurs to me that we have lots to discuss with respect to, well, Shakespeare. I don't know how many dogs appeared in any of the Shakespearean plays, but
there's who is it who says "Let loose the dogs of war"? Is that in Richard III, or is
it sounds like one of the tragedies? Macbeth, Lear, Richard III, something like that. Yeah. But I was going for the less obvious pun with occur. So sorry for that.
That's very clever. I like that.
But here's an interesting topic, because we know that there are certain quotes in the Sherlock Holmes stories that stand out to many of us as obvious Shakespearean references. I mentioned the game's afoot at the top of the show, and we'll explore where that comes from. But we happen to stumble across an old article from the Baker Street Miscellanea. This is a publication that existed in the 80s and 90s from the Sciologist Press, and it was in number 76 from the summer of 1994, which I believe was toward the end of the run.
I think it was the end.
Was that the final issue?
I think so.
Interesting. We found an article by William D. Goodrich called Sherlock Holmes, Shakespeare Scholar, or The Games Afoot.
Yeah, and we should explain that Bill Goodrich is the author, but a little bit better known perhaps as the compiler, the editor, the assembler, the author of the Good Old Index, which is an invaluable guide to the literature of Sherlock Holmes. It's one of, a small number of books that can let you locate various topics, references, mentions in the canon quite easily.
That's right. It's an invaluable resource. And before we get too much further, I should note that "cry havoc, let slip the dogs of war" is a phrase spoken by Mark Antony in Julius Caesar.
Oh, really? Julius Caesar. Well researched. My memory of that is that I think it was wasn't it in Nick Meyer's Star Trek film that Christopher Plummer, I think, maybe I'm just getting my universes mixed up here. But there is, I think, was that in The Wrath of... anyway, I just remember Chris Plummer under makeup having that line of dialogue in some sort of Star Trek.
I think you're right. It was...
As a Klingon, I think
he was. That was Star Trek 6, where Plummer was Chang.
Right.
General Chang, yeah. Good memory.
Yeah, great quote. Great actor.
Well, we're not here to discuss Shakespeare in Star Trek.
No. But I do want to make a couple of points.
Yes.
About Shakespeare. In our discussion here about Holmes and Shakespeare gets us to, what was going on in the Victorian era about Shakespeare. And there was, there are some interesting connections here. I mean, the gist is that, the higher criticism, there from a literary analysis, literary investigation standpoint, the Bible began to be subject to higher criticism, I think beginning in Germany in the late 1700s. And it was that higher criticism, that textual analysis of the Bible, that led Ronald Knox to satirize that by applying similar higher criticism, and others, Ronald Knox and others, similar higher criticism to the world of Sherlock Holmes. Well, one of the things that happened at that point, because of this sort of higher criticism, is that, the Bible lost some venerability, as one might say. And around that time in the Victorian era, it was replaced in popularity, or in common use, or in common reference, let's say, by the works of Shakespeare. And this sort of led to, what some authors have called Victorian bardology, the worship of Shakespeare. And that sort of began in the 300th anniversary of Shakespeare's birth, around in the 1860s. And so what you found was that it became a Victorian practice of delivering sermons, for example, using passages from Shakespeare instead of the Bible, and that just became more and more popular. So Holmes, as a Victorian, was brought up in an era that was very much aware of Shakespeare, that put Shakespearean text to work in lots of situations, in advertising copy, in sermons, in references. And the study of Shakespeare and the reading of Shakespeare, amazingly, as you find from Bill Goodrich's essay here, was really quite extensive, more than one might have thought, in Holmes's own speech.
It is. It absolutely is. And Bill, as you said, wrote Good Old Index, and this article was an outpouring of that effort. He said this quest for Shakespearean quotations and or allusions started as I began work on corrections and additions for the revised edition of Good Old Index. The original purpose of the index was to help me find things in the canon. I've always wanted to determine if there were other close references to Shakespeare in addition to the several mentioned at the head of this article, which are already familiar to many Sherlockians. So why don't we look at those familiar ones, and then after the break we can get into the 24 or so that come from, my goodness, he said he sourced 18 of the plays covering comedies, histories, and tragedies. So we mentioned The Games Afoot. Where's that come from? And where do we find it in the canon?
In the canon, it's from Abbey Grange. And it's also repeated, with the little tense change, The Game Was Afoot, by Watson in Wisteria Lodge. And the source of that is, actually, Shakespeare used that phrase, sort of at least twice. One in Henry V, according to Bill Goodrich here, Act 3, Scene 1, line 32. And then in Henry IV, Part 1, Act 1, Scene 3, line 278. The game is afoot.
The game's afoot, followed by God for Harry, England, and St. George in Henry V. So that's an interesting one. And then, of course, there is the reference to Twelfth Night. And this one's always interesting because Sherlockians, particularly the Morley brothers, preferred January 6th as Sherlock Holmes's birthday because, well, not only was it Felix Morley's own birthday, but January 6th is Twelfth Night. And Christopher Morley notes that Twelfth Night was quoted twice by Holmes, so therefore it must have been his favorite Shakespearean play for good reason. But there we get journeys end in lovers' meetings, as used in The Empty House, and journeys end with lovers' meetings in The Red Circle. And the actual quote from Twelfth Night is slightly different, but it's enough to be called an exact match. Journeys end in lovers' meeting, from Act 2, Scene 3 of Twelfth Night.
It's interesting, isn't it? There are so many chapbooks and compilations of quotation. The processing of Shakespeare's text and rending out some of these quotes in different forms. And of course, Christopher Morley, was at one point an editor of a version of familiar quotations, of Bartlett's familiar quotations. And there are just rafts of Shakespearean quotations here. But it's wonderful to discover these in the cases of Sherlock Holmes. And another one is a touch, Watson, an undeniable touch, which Holmes utters in The Hound of the Baskervilles. And again in Valley of Fear, a touch, a distinct touch. And Bill Goodrich traces that back to a touch, I do confess it, in Hamlet, Act 5, Scene 2, line 286.
Huh. And that's an interesting one. That was almost a throwaway line in The Hound of the Baskervilles and the Valley of Fear, usually replying to some sort of effort of humor. And one wouldn't have thought he would have quoted Shakespeare in that instance, but he certainly did.
Well, what's going on here is that it's not really quoting Shakespeare, but the text and the language becomes so familiar, and these apt phrases for describing things lodge in your mind. And so I think it becomes, in Holmes's case, unconscious.
Well, let's allow our listeners to go unconscious for about a minute while we give them this word from our sponsor. The Baker Street Journal was first published in 1946, and its old series extended through 1949. It picked up again in 1951 and has been publishing ceaselessly every quarter since then. Every issue of the BSJ is packed with top-notch papers, Papers that reflect the sensibilities of Sherlockians from throughout the world. They might be scholarly in nature, giving us details on an aspect of Victorian life that maybe we weren't aware of. They might be tongue-in-cheek, that approach to the game where we wink at each other as we acknowledge Dr. Watson as the true author of the stories and try to figure out some inconsistency. Or they might be something that we never thought was related to Sherlock Holmes, and the author brings it all together for us. Whatever the approach, they're all represented in the Baker Street Journal. Plenty of varying opinions and researches on the world of Sherlock Holmes. Make sure you get on the subscription list to get your copy of the Baker Street Journal delivered to your mailbox every quarter by going to bakerstreetirregulars.com today. And don't forget that as a patron of Trifles, you are automatically entered for an annual subscription to the Baker Street Journal every quarter. So just check us out at patreon.com/trifles. You know, as you were mentioning there before the break, Bert, this immersion of Shakespeare into the common consciousness, into common language. It's not necessarily that or Sherlock Holmes was quoting the play, just using a phrase that had become part of the vernacular. I wrote an entry in a newsletter I do called Off the Clock. I look at words and language and whatnot, and recently looked at some of the phrases that we use now that were introduced by Shakespeare, like puking, which was from As You Like It. At first the infant mewling and puking in the nurse's arms. A method to your madness from Hamlet. A wild goose chase from Romeo and Juliet. Break the ice from Taming of the Shrew, and many, many others. So I'll have a link to that essay in the show notes if people want to look at that a little more deeply.
Oh, it's a wonderful topic. You know, Shakespeare was so adept at doing things like changing nouns into verbs, and then sort of verbs become adjectives, and then he connects words that were never before apparently used together, and then he makes up some words, he creates some words. So it was a real linguistic innovator. And before I forget, I really should mention that Ken Ludwig, if any of our readers and listeners are interested in thinking more about Shakespeare, and particularly if you have young children and have the idea that wouldn't it be great if my kids knew something about Shakespeare, Ken has an author who's written several plays, award-winning author who's written several plays, several Sherlockian plays, member of the Baker Street Irregulars, a guest on our other program, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, frequent speaker, has written a wonderful book called How to Teach Your Children Shakespeare, which is highly recommended.
Oh, that's a great idea. We'll have a link to that book and to the episode in which Ken appeared on I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere. Well, why don't we hop back into some of these quotations? I don't know that we need to cover every single one of them, but there are some interesting ones, obscure ones, I think, that Bill did a really nice job calling out.
Yeah, some surprised me. You know, for example, stale, flat, and unprofitable. I never thought of that as having a Shakespearean...
That's my business logo. My motto.
Yes. It would make all fiction most stale and unprofitable, says Holmes in A Case of Identity. And Bill links that to, again, back to Hamlet. How weary, stale, flat, and unprofitable seem to me all the uses of this world. Act 1, Scene 2.
That's a great one. And it's not surprising that Hamlet would be a source for many of these phrases. I mean, it's certainly... I would argue Shakespeare's most popular play, and featured star trotters of the boards in every era. So certainly during Holmes's time would have been equally as relevant. This phrase always seemed poetic to me, and it makes great sense now. From the case of the disappearance of Lady Frances Carfax, that's late in the canon, thrice is he armed who hath his quarrel just. And that is an exact quote from Henry VI, Part 2 in Act 3.
And then in Empty House, of course, this is a familiar one that goes back to Antony and Cleopatra, where Holmes remarks, "I trust that age doth not wither nor custom stale my infinite variety," which is a pretty specific quote. Antony remarks about Cleopatra, "Age cannot wither her nor custom stale her infinite variety," in Act 2, Scene 2.
I like how Holmes was comparing himself to Cleopatra. That's an interesting placement there. And here's one. This is often used at Sherlockian gatherings when we're having dinners. There are very few vegetables mentioned in the stories, but green peas from the Three Students are among them. And the quote there is, "The landlady babbled of green peas at 7:30. Well, that is actually alluded to in Henry V, a babbled of green fields.
Yeah, that missed me completely. I never thought of any.
Well, we know a little farm in Lincolnshire where every July
peas grow there.
And for those of you who don't know that reference, we will include a link to Orson Welles doing a voiceover for Frozen Peas, which is hysterical. You'll get it more after you listen to us here.
Yeah, poor Orson. Yeah. Fascinating, too. And then, there are so many of these. One that I never thought of, is this reference in Sign of Four, where Holmes simply says, a strange enigma is man. And Bill Goodrich hops that back again to Hamlet, Act 2, Scene 2, where Hamlet remarks, "What a piece of work is man." And, of course, that whole passage, where he's talking to Rosencrantz and Guildenstern is so lovely, how noble in reason, how infinite in faculty. But, and he's just sort of reflecting this little bit of moral philosophy, which I guess Holmes was quite familiar with.
Yeah, and, he actually quoted the title of one of Shakespeare's plays in The Sign of Four as well. So we not only get that allusion to Hamlet, but he says, "All's well that ends well." That was an easy one. And toward the end of, or at the end of The Speckled Band, he also uses a really nice turn of phrase. I've always admired this just in terms of its observation of humanity. Violence does, in truth, recoil upon the violent. And that is an allusion to Romeo and Juliet, Act 2, Scene 6. These violent delights have violent ends.
Yeah, and that never occurred to me either. That, and there are many other references. For example, in Bruce Partington Plans, where Holmes remarks, "Who's Cadogan West, and what is he to Mycroft?" And Bill finds an echo there, and "What's Hecuba to him, or he to Hecuba?" from Hamlet again. And then a very popular one, "Thereby hangs a tale." That sort of pops up, from Sherlock Holmes in Boscombe Valley Mystery, and has been appeared in Shakespeare in various places, in Taming of the Shrew, and The Merry Wives of Windsor, and in Othello, where various characters react, "Well, thereby hangs a tale."
And I mentioned there was a method in his madness before, method in your madness, as I talked about the essay that I wrote. Well, in the Reigate Squire, there was a method in his madness was used as a quote, and also again in Reigate Squire. So that was Watson talking about Holmes, and then Inspector Forrester said there was a madness in his method. Kind of reversing the phrase there. And that is taken directly from Hamlet, Though this be madness, yet there is a method in it.
Yeah. Well, and there are so many more. The course of true love does not run quite as smoothly as one would under the circumstances expect, which Watson says in The Hound, which refers back to Midsummer Night's Dream. And then little references like her mind was pure as snow from Lady Frances Carfax, which is another link back to Hamlet. And then, a lovely one is one who did not wish to have greatness thrust upon him, from Valley of Fear, which I guess is said by McMurdo, refers back to Twelfth Night, Act 2, Scene 5. Some are born great, some achieve greatness, and some have greatness thrust upon them.
That's a great one. Well, there are many phrases from Shakespeare that find their way into the Sherlock Holmes stories. There's probably more that you can find. There's more here in Bill's essay. We don't want to completely bore you, but just goes to show that we can look at the canon from all kinds of different lenses and discover, truly a remarkable representation of the world at large.
And it's far from a trifle.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You've taken my breath away, Mr. Holmes.
I trust that age doth not with no custom stale my infinite variety.